1981. After undergoing eye surgery, patient Bill Mason wakes up in hospital, covered in bandages, with nobody around to help him.
Hey! Do you think I could possibly have some breakfast? Room 22?
He removes his bandages and finds himself in a strange, almost post-apocalyptic world. While he was undergoing surgery, a meteor shower rendered most of humanity completely blind. While looking for survivors and other sighted people like himself, Bill soon realizes there's another, more dangerous existential threat out there. Aggressive, deadly, carnivorous plants known as Triffids that are taking advantage of this new pandemic by wiping people out one by one. Join me as we continue exploring the evolution of nature in horror, and we discuss the BBC's adaptation of John Wyndham's sci-fi classic, The Day of the Triffids. Welcome back to the evolution of horror. My name is Mike Muncer, and as ever, I am your host. In this podcast, we explore and dissect the history and the evolution of the horror genre, one subgenre at a time. We are currently in the middle of our 10th season, exploring the evolution of nature biting back in horror, and this is part 18. In this week's episode, as that intro suggested, we are going to be looking at John Wyndham's Day of the Triffids novel, and particularly the BBC adaptation from 1981. This will be a spoilerific discussion. If you can track down the TV show, it's 6 half-hour episodes, and they are available to stream for free online. I will link to it in the show notes. Please do try and give it a watch before you listen to our discussion. So, joining me to discuss Triffids, well, who else would I get to discuss this horror sci-fi classic but the co-hosts of the world's greatest sci-fi podcast, Journey Through Sci-Fi. It's Matt and James. Hello, guys.
Hello, Mike.
Hello, guys. How is it going? Matt, you're back currently with a new series of Journey Through Sci-Fi, right?
Yeah, we've just started our new series. It's all about mad science. So we're covering mad science, mad scientists, and crazy experiments all gone wrong or gone right, I guess, in some cases.
Mm-hmm. I love this. James, I kind of, when you guys showed me the list, I sort of wanted to volunteer to talk about basically all of them, because there's quite a lot of horror, right, in this particular season.
It feels like a very you series, Mike, I've got to be honest.
Yeah.
Like, mad science basically falls into the horror category 7-8 times out of 10, I would say.
Yeah. So excited. Are there any particular titles any particular ones you're looking forward to diving into this series?
We've already recorded, I don't know when this is coming out, we've already recorded some really heavy hitters based on proper literary classics in the genre. Mm-hmm. But at some point we're going to be talking Jurassic Park, which we have not covered on our show, which obviously is one of the best movies ever made. So I think that's right up there for me.
Will you also be doing Jurassic Park, The Lost World, Jurassic Park 3, Jurassic World, all that shit?
Hey, you've got to go onto Patreon for that kind of stuff. That's like a full-on series. We've got a lot of mad science films to cover. We can't be doing every single Jurassic Park on the main feed.
Well, I've got on my own Patreon a chat with you two on The Lost World and Jurassic Park 3, I think. And
because you know what you're doing, Mike.
Yeah, I know what I'm doing. And I seem to remember, Matt, you being particularly scathing about, I think, Jurassic Park 3 in that.
I was the other day, I was like clearing out all the pictures in my screenshots folder because I just never delete anything from that on my phone, and I was just going through deleting, and I saw one that was like, the thumbnail was a picture of a velociraptor, and I opened it up and it was the velociraptor just with the subtitles on saying Alan in the plane in Jurassic Park 3. It just made me really chuckle to myself. What a silly film.
But Jurassic Park is like a nature bites back film, though, isn't it? Surely,
right? There is actually a bit of crossover, and I've been like, I've basically set rules for myself, and then I have continuously broke them, right, throughout this series, to the point where people keep correcting me and writing in, even with Day of the Triffids, which we'll get into. Is almost like a mix, right, of nature bites back, but also mad science a little bit as well. Like, there's a bit of that to it, and I think these two subgenres kind of cross over quite a bit. But yeah, Jurassic Park, yeah, you could say it's about dinosaurs, but actually they're sort of man-made theme park creatures, really, right? I think that's the point that Alan Grant makes, is that they're not real dinosaurs. They're like genetically created monsters, basically. So I'm like, I'm not going to include it in this series.
You've got them on a technicality there, Mike.
I know, but it's so silly because now, I've created a rod for my own back, because then I'm like, well, I can't cover the movie about giant ants because they were made by sort of atomic like waste or whatever, which is technically more of a kind of mad science theme, but then it's very difficult. It's a very blurry line.
Look, we feel you on that, Mike. Every single series, it's how are we going to get this one into this subgenre, but then still save this film, which we want to talk about later down the line. It's a balance, isn't it? It's a balancing act.
It's a balance. If people want to listen to Nature Bites Back, they can stay here. If people want to listen to mad science, they could go listen to Journey Through Sci-Fi, and there'll probably be loads of crossover. So there you go. They work perfectly in tandem with each other.
Exactly.
Let me ask you about this kind of subgenre that I'm covering then. Like, we are kind of fundamentally dealing with like the dangers and the horrors of nature. So whether that's like animal attack movies, natural disaster movies, all of that kind of thing. Matt, what do you think of these sorts of movies? Are you a big fan of like the big classics like Jaws and The Birds and that kind of stuff?
Yeah, I love them. I love the Godzilla movies a lot as well. I do like these, but I don't particularly find them scary, because for the most part, like 99% of this genre of films is animals, isn't it? Is the nature in particular. And generally speaking, I just tend to feel empathy with the animal. It's really hard to not feel that way, and it's hard to make a good film in this genre that really casts the animal as the bad guy, like a bad guy that you can really root against. But I still enjoy them. Like even like Cujo, where it's like a dog and it's really sad. It's still like, it's a good film, stuff like that.
It's so right what you were saying, Matt, because last week we did Cujo, and it's quite scary in some ways, but more than anything, I just felt so sad for that dog. Yeah. Like, you just feel like you want to make sure that dog is okay, basically, don't you?
And across the Godzilla films are a great example of that as well. The way they kind of change track, in particularly in the like 70s and 80s, and then he becomes like more of a superhero character. But even when you watch the first one, like, he's just rampaging around, and it's just like, he doesn't know what he's doing. He's been blasted with atomic energy. Like, you got to leave this guy alone.
It's not their fault most of the time, is it? It's not their fault. James, what do you think of these movies? Are you a big fan of the whole animal attack genre?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one, isn't it? But the way that Matt was just talking about it, it's very focused on, because this is Nature Bites Back, isn't it? So it's not just animals. There's also vegetables and minerals to a degree. I don't know if you've got any minerals attacking people or biting back.
I love this. I wonder if I do. We must do somewhere, I reckon.
You've got to find something like that. But specifically with this one, it's plant-based, isn't it? It's a plant-based horror.
There's not been many of those. And later on this series, I'm doing another film that I think also we three have talked about on my Patreon, which is M. Night Shyamalan's The Happening.
Yeah,
an absolute classic.
Scary plant film.
Trees.
Scary plants. We'll talk later about how scary plants are in films. I don't know if that's quite a difficult thing to pull off, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a whole series on plant-based horror in addition to Nature Bites Back. But yeah, I think in terms of Nature Bites Back stuff and sort of nature getting its own back on humanity, I think there's not a particular animal that scares me per se. Like, there's lots
You're not like an arachnophobic or anything like that?
No, I quite like spiders, I think they're doing a good job. They're getting rid of all the flies. I'd rather have less flies, more spiders I can't see in the corners of the room.
I'm so with you on that one. I used to be terrified of spiders. I've completely come around on them because I hate flies so much that I just consider like the spiders in my house to be like employees of mine. Like,
they're like lodgers, aren't they? Basically, yeah. I agree with that. Although, James, one story I will never forget is that story about you getting a bat in your room once.
Oh,
like,
God.
That is fucking terrifying.
I haven't heard this story.
This was a whole thing. So my stepdad is very much a country guy. He's like a country.
I didn't know what you were going to say.
So he knows all about like the country and nature and sort of what to do when these kind of things happen. I was in the town where I grew up in, had the window open, a bat flew in, I lost my shit. I didn't know what to do. It's flying around. I thought it was a bird, just continuously going round and round and round. This was probably like 12, maybe 1 a.m. in the morning. And I'm freaking out, so I wake my stepdad up, country guy. He knows what to do, obviously.
Also, like, just to say, James wasn't a child then. You were like 20 or something, right, when this happened. Just before you get to the whole, and I woke my stepdad up.
It's not like a quaint story. I'm just up late, and then he's got work tomorrow, so I've woken him up. He's pissed off. And the way he devises to get rid of this bat from the room is he puts up a bed sheet and then gets white noise from a radio to get the bat's sonar to go out the window. I don't know if this is just all bullshit.
Yeah. Flush it out with sound.
Yeah.
Incredible.
So he did that and it went out the window and I was absolutely fine. But absolutely the most terrifying experience to have when you're watching TV in your room at like midnight, 1 a.m., whenever the hell it was, and then a bat flies in. I was scared it was going to shit everywhere, I've got to be honest. That was my main worry.
I mean, that is one of the all-time panics, though, right? Like, like, Matt, have you ever had a bird fly into your house? Because that is always, like, it's a panic for the bird, it's a panic for the people, it's a nightmare.
Yeah, I don't think I have. I don't think that's happened to me. I don't want it to happen. I think that we've had, because I've had cats, like, for most of my life. I remember as a kid, like, our cat would bring in half-dead birds.
Actually, cats are also very useful animals just to have in the house for that reason, right?
Yeah, sometimes, yeah.
We often talk about your cat on the podcast, don't we, Matt?
Yeah.
Just in terms of usefulness and also like
uselessness,
unusefulness, uselessness.
Yeah. I don't know. I think they're doing a good job. You got to convince. They're completely useless most of the time. I think most cats. You got to convince yourself that the real job they're doing is just scaring off all of the rats that you aren't seeing, right? So if you don't see a rat, then your cat did something that you weren't aware of. You got to convince yourself of that.
I think that's true because having not had a cat and living in London, the mice problem and the rats were a nightmare, which you probably had less of than.
Oh, okay. Yeah, no, I've never had like it. Oh, there you go. Hey,
there you go. You see.
Do your rabbits scare any creatures off, Mike?
Do you know what? They actually do. Like, we have a lot of cats in our neighbourhood and cats come into our garden sometimes. And initially we were a bit worried that they were going to try and like go for our rabbits. But our rabbits, as you guys have seen them, are fucking huge. They've grown so big. They're actually bigger than the cats now. So the cats kind of look at them and like not quite sure what to do. And then the rabbits will come towards them and then the cats will scarper over the fence, basically. So there you go. Don't mess with the rabbits. Do you think as well, though, that the subgenre has taken on more of a... I think what's been interesting, Matt, is especially in the last 10 or 20 years, that nature, climate change and all of this kind of thing, pandemics, have posed a real threat, right? I think it's interesting because I think you're right. A lot of the time, these movies aren't that scary. They can actually be quite like silly B movies when you think of like snakes on a plane and stuff like that. But actually, nature in some ways poses a bigger threat to us than almost anything else, I would say. You know?
Yeah, and there is sort of a real fear in that. And I think we might get into this when we talk about Triffids a bit more, is that something about the way that nature can make you feel incredibly small and powerless, and the way that nature, as a sort of concept and a creature unto itself, it just doesn't care about you as a human. And if you are ever out somewhere where you are given a reminder of that, that's quite humbling. So if you can capture that on film, like that works really well. And then, if you can layer on top of that some interesting sort of social commentary as well to comment on all the ecological things that you're just referring to, you can have a really good movie on your hands. I don't know. We can talk later if we think that Triffids kind of strikes those chords or not.
Because I think it can link in, can't it, James, with like almost apocalypse type movies. Like I'm going to be talking about stuff like Melancholia and stuff later on this series, all those kind of happy movies. But like even Children of Men, there's a little bit of nature bites back to the kind of the premise of Children of Men and stuff. And I like that it also kind of almost verges into post-apocalypse in a way when you talk about nature and the planet kind of destroying us almost.
Well, they're intrinsically linked, aren't they? Because the idea of a post-apocalypse is we've fucked up the world and then we're trying to build it up again. But we can't build it up in the same way. We have to go back to basics and we have to look at the natural world and how the natural world works and then go from there. So that's why every single post-apocalyptic film, and this one included, has a kind of like a mossy landscape.
Yeah.
All of the buildings are decaying. Mankind has fallen. But it also looks really luscious and green because nature has kind of rejuvenated itself. Kind of like, do you remember all the news reports during the pandemic?
Yeah,
So
about how pollution went down and all of that stuff.
Yeah, so in all the news stuff, they were talking about how nature has come back, nature is thriving again, and then afterwards it goes back to normal. But it kind of really hammers home exactly the impact that we have on the planet, just how it can completely spring back to life given even a few months. So give it a few years in a post-apocalyptic landscape, who knows?
Yeah, it's so true, actually. It is almost like COVID. I remember that initially happening, and it's almost like nature just slightly restoring the balance, right? For at least those few months that initially happened.
Terribly morbid and a horrendous time.
But it's kind of true.
Yeah.
It's kind of true, yeah. Matt, are you much of a kind of like outdoorsy person, would you say? Are you good at kind of being like away from your like creature comforts and being at one with the elements?
Yeah. Small doses, yeah. I like a good country walk. And I like camping as well. But I mean, look, I'm not going to try and fool you two guys. Like I'm a sit in front of the TV kind of guy. That's the kind of guy I am. But I like nature. I like getting outside. I like a nice big walk and hiking and stuff like that.
James, would you like a nice hike through the Amazon rainforest or through the Sahara Desert?
You went straight for the Amazon rainforest. It wasn't like, we're going to a forest in Kent or something.
Pub walk in Kent.
Completely different divisions there. I mean, the Amazon rainforest sounds lovely, but I think
everything there wants to kill you, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Like practically, it would not suit me well. And also, I've got loads of allergies, so I'd probably find something to be allergic to wherever I am.
Oh God, nature actually often is trying to kill you, James, isn't it? Like
Often.
you do have you've got a lot of allergies going on. Yeah, that wouldn't be great for you. Well, let's talk then a little bit about Day of the Triffids. So there are loads of versions of this. Obviously, there was a novel in 1951, and then there's been like a film and a couple of different TV adaptations. I'm going to talk about the one from 1981, which like is generally regarded, especially by fans, as like the best ever adaptation of this story. So first of all, just Matt, could you give us a little brief setup for people that don't know what is Day of the Triffids all about?
So Day of the Triffids follows the story of a group of survivors following a kind of apocalyptic event. The apocalyptic event in question is a meteor shower that causes everyone who looks at it, which is most of the population, to go blind. Which has a knock-on effect of basically society breaking down. People can't seem to function without their sight at a sort of societal level, and we follow the survivors who are just trying to get by in that new world. And meanwhile, there's a bunch of plants roaming around called Triffids that want to kill people.
Yeah.
Which is kind of an ancillary plot point, is that fair to say? But it is also the main plot point. It's Day of the Triffids.
It's kind of interesting, right, that those two are sort of two separate things, right? Like, as far as I'm aware, James, the meteor shower that blinds everyone has nothing to do with these plants that can walk around and kill people, right? Like, the two incidents aren't related.
No, they kind of they allude to them being related in some sort of way later on, because they kind of insinuate that the whole thing is man-made to a degree.
Right.
But you're right, like on the surface layer, it's a post-apocalyptic story about a tragic catastrophe that's happened, and there just so happens to be this added extra that blind people now have to combat with killer plants, carnivorous plants that are out to get them. So it's got that added bit to it.
What did you guys think of this, Matt? What did you think? Was this the first time you had watched this TV adaptation?
Yeah, my main takeaway was that there aren't very many Triffids in it.
Yeah.
I had a sort of concept of Triffids because they've been, parodied and referenced in other like bits of sci-fi that I've read and watched. So I had an idea of what Triffids were. which was accurate, and it is what they are as depicted. It's just I was expecting a lot more Triffid stuff in this.
Was it the first time, Matt, that you had seen like any adaptation of this story? Like, was it
Yeah.
the first time you'd like explored this story, basically?
Yeah, no, I've never come across it. I've read a book. There's a book by Robert Rankin called Snuff Fiction, which is just like a silly comedy sci-fi fantasy book that I've read loads of times because I love it. And I think that it's like partially parodying this because it's kind of got a post-apocalyptic situation that happens with plants, deadly plants roaming around as well. So I'm realizing that I think borrows a lot from this, but I've never actually gone to the source.
James, what about you? How like familiar were you with this whole story? Like, had you seen it before, read it, or anything like that?
I was very familiar with the story because I read it at school. I had a really beaten up copy of Day of the Triffids. And I remember watching 28 Days Later and being like, what? This is just Day of the Triffids without the Triffids.
Oh.
Right.
So this has properly stuck with me throughout my life, like this initial story, because I was given the book by an uncle, hence why it was such a battered copy. So this particular story has always held a special place in my heart.
Oh, I love that. Oh, that's quite good to know. And so what did you think of this adaptation, James? Because I've heard that this is one of the most kind of faithful adaptations of the book as well.
Yeah, it's pretty much as the book reads. Obviously, you get different stuff from reading it as opposed to watching it. There's more focus on the lead character and sort of his inner monologue and all that kind of stuff. And the Triffids they're much more terrifying in your head.
Yeah.
So the idea of these killer plants being in the sort of background of everything that these characters are doing and the sort of constant threat of them is much more prominent in the book. And then when you adapt it to a BBC TV show, it's harder to get that mixture right. There's also stuff with the characters, which I'll go into probably later, in terms of like certain plot points, which they kind of miss out. But a lot of it's to do with like ideology and sort of the different social groups and the political groups that they have. Again, most of that is fleshed out in the BBC TV show, though. So I was really impressed watching this, and just seeing it brought to life because I'd never seen it on screen. So I enjoyed it a lot.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it as well. This was the first time for me as well, and I really liked it. And that was some of the stuff that I was most kind of pleasantly surprised about. Because you're right, Matt. There's a lot less like people being attacked by killer plants, and there's a lot more like how do we rebuild society and different people trying in different ways and often failing to kind of rebuild society or create a community or something, right? And how did you find that generally, Matt, the way in which that kind of human story develops throughout the show?
That stuff I absolutely loved, and I was really surprised by it because, like I said, I was expecting, as you say, mostly people getting attacked by plants. I thought that was what it was going to be about. So I was really pleasantly surprised that wasn't what it was about. And as James says, the 28 Days Later connections, the starting scenes are exactly like 28 Days Later, but it continues like a lot of the roaming around London, escaping hordes of scary people, and ending up in a farmhouse where things get tense and weird. You know, it kind of follows all the beats. So I was making the same connections James did all those years ago. I was like, well, this is just... But I did it. I guess I did it in reverse. I was like, this is just 28 days later. But all that like rebuilding society, it plays out really weird because I think, you know, you've got people talking about like new sets of rules for how society should be rebuilt. And it's like 2 days after the meteor shower. Yeah. And that kind of crops up throughout the show, I thought. But in general, the concept of having those conversations is a really fun kind of sci-fi thing where we talk about really big, grand ideas about society and civilization through the lens of, you know, the plant-based horror.
Yeah, I almost thought it whizzed by for me. So like I pretty much binged it, James, like the 6 half-hour episodes. And you're right, actually, if anything, it felt like it's kind of moving on to the next community and the next thing almost too quickly throughout it, you know? Like I think these days, if this had been like an HBO show, it would have taken about 20 hours to cover all of the ground, right? I think of something like The Last of Us almost. There's almost a bit of The Last of Us, I think, as well in these sorts of things, isn't there? But yeah, like that kind of, it almost felt like it was like too pacey at times, which is interesting.
It's because it's like 26 minutes an episode, 25 minutes an episode, so they've got to pack a lot in. It's quite a small book, but they are doing a lot of exposition, they're setting the scene, but they've got character development in there as well, which is great because they spend time with the characters. There's some stuff they kind of skim over, but I think that's just the nature of the beast with this TV show.
Yeah.
But going back to what sort of Matt was saying about this kind of like like echoing things like 28 Days Later and all that kind of stuff, like John Wyndham, his work has always had this, they've coined a phrase to describe it called cozy catastrophes.
Oh yeah,
which I think is brilliant because that's exactly what he does. Like in some of his other work, like the Chrysalids, it's like a post-apocalyptic society persecuting people with genetic mutations, but it's sort of localized. And the same with the Midwich Cuckoos, or the Village of the Damned, as most people know it as. Like you've got a small community dealing with these superhuman children, but all of it's like these extraordinary circumstances, these extraordinary disasters, but you've got this stiff upper lip British society dealing with them. And that's what's happening in Day of the Triffids. Like everyone's trying to be practical about what to do next, but it's got this real British sensibility to it. And I think that's the joy of it as well, especially with it being, with this show being produced by the BBC, it's got all of that like sensibility, that weight to it, and I think that really adds to this story, whereas something like your 28 Days Later expands on that, takes it more sort of Hollywood almost, and then later on you get stuff like Resident Evil, and it's like an early zombie film, isn't it?
It is definitely like you say, 28 Days Later, The Girl with All the Gifts, The Last of Us, like they all feel like they owe a bit of a debt to the Day of the Triffids. And Danny Boyle has actually said on the record that he said Alex Garland wrote this story inspired by Day of the Triffids as well. So like I think it's a definite direct influence. And yeah, you're right. Like Matt, do you find that too? There's like a very quaint Britishness to it. And I think maybe also coming from the early 80s, I feel like it has that kind of 70s Doctor Who vibe a little bit to it as well. Like it is running in that tradition of kind of 70s sci-fi horror TV, you know?
Yeah, totally. You can completely imagine this story playing out almost exactly the same, but with the Doctor present.
Yeah.
I think the difference would be that like the Doctor would find a solution and get things back together by the end, and sort of send the Triffids off to another planet or whatever. You know, he would be fixing things all the way through. It would not be a story about trying to rebuild society or, you know, try and find a way to live a sustainable life. It would be basically following the Doctor around and fending off people like the soldiers at the end so that he can find a solution. So it just ends on this kind of not downer but a bit of a melancholy note that I think a Doctor Who serial would have not ended on, but the tone feels exactly the same.
Yeah, it really does, doesn't it, James? We've talked a little bit together about kind of like horror in TV and Doctor Who and that kind of thing, and I've mentioned before about how there was this like really popular wave of quite scary kids TV shows and family TV shows, particularly in the 70s. And like, did you find that connection too? Like Day of the Triffids definitely has a bit of that vibe, I think.
Yeah, it does, and it's even down to the guys working on it as well, because you've got Douglas Livingston, who was writing this, who adapted this from the original like novel, and then you've got David Maloney, who produced it, who'd worked on Doctor Who and Blake Seven, so you've got the same sort of production staff in it, but then also just drawing from all those other popular sci-fi, those horror TV shows which are really sort of gaining audiences, which are scaring kids at home watching their TV sets and haven't got access to this. And you can imagine being a kid in 1981 having maybe read the novel, or not, maybe not even having read the novel, and then seeing this on TV. You've got this terrifying intro, you've got this terrifying plant that's I can't even say terrifying plant with a straight face, but you've got this terrifying entity that's in the background the whole time, and it's spooky, and it's something you haven't seen before, so you're hiding behind the sofa like you do with Doctor Who, like you do with a lot of these programs at the time, and it's giving you a real scare.
The theme tunes as well. The theme tunes do not fuck around in these old kind of 70s and 80s British TV shows. It's like kind of Children of the Stone and that kind of thing. There's almost an element of kind of British folk horror to this, as well as the sci-fi, which in itself feels a bit Nigel Neal, and he was so popular at this time as well. So you can definitely feel a kind of mix of influences. And it's really interesting. I mean, I couldn't find, I'm sure somebody can write in and tell me, but I couldn't find any information about what time of day this was broadcast. I'm assuming it's kind of evening viewing, right? But I was trying to work out, like, was this aimed at families, including kids? Because it's quite scary and quite dark, and it deals with some quite adult themes, especially when they get into all of the kind of social, political stuff about repopulating the earth and everything. But then also the big rubber killer plants, right? It does feel very Doctor Who.
I think thematically, like, I think that you could broadcast this to, in like a Doctor Who slot.
Yeah.
I don't know, and I don't know. I've just got an idea in my head that like kids in 1981 would be able to handle it better, or the perception would be that they can handle it better. So yeah, I think they wouldn't mind. I can totally imagine this being a sort of prime time broadcast, and kids would watch it as well and be terrified of orchids for the rest of their lives.
Exactly. And back then there were probably, in 1981, I think, only 3 channels as well. So this did get millions and millions, like tens of millions of people watching it, because back then there was much more of a kind of monoculture of what people watched, I think. So I think a lot of people have these like incredibly fond memories of this show, of watching it for the first time. So it begins obviously with this main character, and he's had some sort of operation on his eyes, right? So that's why he's been unaffected, because he's missed the meteor shower. And like you guys have said, it starts with that kind of eerie vibe, like where you don't really know what's going on in the first episode. It's just this guy in a hospital kind of talking to a tape recorder and trying to figure out what's going on. What do you think, James, of this main character of Bill? He's played by John Turteen in this show, and he's kind of our like guide throughout this whole thing, isn't he?
Oh, he is great. And I sent you guys a picture of him in our WhatsApp group, and you said he looks like Matt initially said he looks like what my dad looked like in the 80s. And then, Mike, you said, I feel like he looks like all dads in the 80s.
Yes, that is how I imagine all British men of that age looking in the 80s.
Perfect description of this lead character in this TV show. But he's great, and he's doing what he needs to do. It's kind of like, but also, so you talked about like how he's blind at the start. This is a bit of a tangent, but we tried to make a podcast way back when, and it was a blind guy who wakes up in a hospital and is trying to sort of make his way around the hospital. And I didn't tell you at the time, but I completely ripped that off Day of the Triffids.
I can't believe this, James, because I thought of exactly that, because me and James wanted to write a fiction kind of horror mystery podcast. And we were trying to figure out like a good way to create a story like via kind of audio drama. And we were like, well, what if it's like from the perspective of someone who can't see? And so therefore, like as a like something where you write what's going on, there might be a bit more of a description. And yeah, as I started watching this first episode, I was like, wait a minute.
But I was like, I can't tell you that this is the entire first part of Day of the Triffids, because also, how do I explain this plot to you and where it goes? But yeah, that was a little bit of random information.
So good. And there is this kind of running, almost kind of romance, I guess, Matt, isn't there? Like you've got this kind of this character of Bill, and then he meets this woman called Jo, who is played by Emma Relf in the TV show, and these two that are kind of get together and then are kind of torn apart. How did you find that, these two characters as these kind of protagonists through the show?
I thought that it was fine, and like it was a believable romance, and I thought they had like genuine chemistry, well acted. But it was another element of the show where I couldn't escape the timeline in my head, because they were talking about like, first of all, one group of people are talking about like enforced polyamorous marriages to repopulate the earth 2 days after the world ended.
Yeah, you get the feeling that maybe they were just looking for any excuse, these people.
The woman who's announcing that has got a very thorough plan in a big binder. But in the same scene, is it Jo? Is that her name? Jo and Bill are talking about getting married, and she's like, "Oh, if we must be married, can we be married?" And it's like, again, like just known each other for like 2 days. But it's like that speed thing, isn't it? With Sandra Bullock's like people who meet under,
when it's the end of the world,
it's always,
you do what you got to do.
But there's a thing in the book which makes that make more sense. So Jo, Gisela Clayton, she'd written a book called Sex is My Adventure. And it was a big sensationalist novel. And it was like really notable around the time. And her family had disapproved about it. It was all about her challenging societal norms. So when they sort of bring up the whole polyamory thing, it's kind of like she's like, oh well, I've put this in my like book. I'm quite sort of like free and sexually liberated, and it doesn't come as left field. And if anything, it's our lead character who's kind of sort of like being like, okay, so I know you as being this kind of person.
Interesting. I guess that's some of the stuff that early 80s BBC TV, they thought we'd better not go near that almost. But that does...
Shame. Absolute shame.
That is a shame. And that does make a lot more sense, actually, because what is that world that they're trying to introduce that woman has that very in-depth manifesto of, Matt? It's kind of like... men can have multiple wives because at this point it's all about basically creating babies, right? And really the people with sight are the only ones that are kind of any use to this community. The men without sight aren't basically needed, right?
Yeah, they'll keep on board women without sight because they will give birth to babies who do have sight. So men must take on multiple wives in order to repopulate the earth as quickly as possible. It's this guise of pragmatism that we must do this, but there's a sort of patriarchal undertone to it all that feels very Handmaid's Tale, doesn't it?
Exactly. Like you always get the feeling, don't you, that it's descending into some kind of dystopian patriarchy.
Happy, happy Halloween, Halloween, Halloween. Happy, happy Halloween, silver shamrock. Happy, happy Halloween, Halloween, Halloween. Happy, happy Halloween, silver shamrock.
It's almost time, kids. The clock is ticking. Be in front of your TV sets for the Horathon. And remember the big giveaway at 9. Don't miss it. And don't forget to wear your masks. The clock is ticking. It's almost time.
Happy, happy Halloween.
That little earworm can only mean one thing. It's spooky season. And we've got so much exciting stuff happening across October here at the Evolution of Horror. As well as weekly episodes of the podcast dropping, we've also got events happening around the UK and online for anyone around the world to join. So if you head to evolutionofhorror.com/events, you will find all of the details of what we've got coming up. But I will quickly run through it now. Tonight, on Friday the 4th of October, I'm going to be hosting a sold-out screening of the horror anime classic Perfect Blue from 1997. Really excited for that one, and the live on-stage discussion of the film will be dropping as a Patreon episode in the next couple of weeks. Next week, on Saturday the 12th of October, I'm going to be up in Newcastle to host a very special Wes Craven double bill. We're going to be at the Tyneside Cinema and we're going to be screening Shocker from 1989, followed by Wes Craven's New Nightmare from 1994, which turns 30 years old this month. There's also going to be a live podcast discussion of Wes Craven and his career on stage. There are still a few tickets left for that, so if you are within reach of Newcastle, come along. That's on Saturday the 12th of October. Then a week later, on Friday the 18th of October, back down in London, I am going to be hosting a special screening of Brian De Palma's Carrie from 1976 at the beautiful Regent Street Cinema, one of the oldest and most beautiful cinemas in London. I am going to be there to screen the film, and then I'll be joined on stage by Izara Barber Brown, Becky Dark and Rihanna Dillon to discuss that movie with an audience in depth. So there are still tickets available for that one. Come along and join us if you can. 2 days later, on Sunday the 20th of October, October. This is an event that anyone around the world can join. I'm going to be hosting a special Halloween pub quiz online. It's going to be streamed on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/evolution of horror. Anyone who's done my quizzes before will know the drill. You simply need to watch it, have a pad and pen with you, and just jot down your answers as you go. You can play individually or in a team. Doesn't really matter. It's more just the fun of watching and playing along and interacting with other quizzers in the comments. So please do join me for that one. That's at 8 p.m. UK time. That's 8 p.m. BST on Sunday, the 20th of October on our YouTube channel. Then on Thursday, the 24th of October, we're going to be back up north in Lancaster to screen Shaun of the Dead for its 20th anniversary. I cannot believe that film is 20 years old. That's going to be followed by a panel discussion with Adam Z. Robinson, Becky Dark, and Chris Newton. That's going to be a really fun night. So that's going to be at the Duke's Cinema in Lancaster. Then another online event at the end of the month on Wednesday, the 30th of October. We are going to be streaming this month's edition of Fresh Blood live on YouTube. So Fresh Blood, for people who don't know, it's a monthly strand that we have over on Patreon, in which me, Becky Dark, Brad Hanson, and Steph McKenna review and discuss all of the new releases that month in horror. So we're going to be streaming this month's episode live, which means that you guys can watch along, you can comment, we can interact with you as we record it. So you'll just need to head to our YouTube channel, youtube.com/evolution of horror, and watch along at 8 p.m. UK time on Wednesday, the 30th of October. Finally, on Halloween night, it's the big one. We've got a live 1-hour show back at the Regent Street Cinema in London. I am going to be joined by some very special guests. Editor-in-Chief of Den of Geek, Rosie Fletcher, award-winning FX artist and friend of the pod, of course, Dan Martin, and award-winning writer and actor, the man behind League of Gentlemen, Inside Number 9 and Psychoville, Reece Shearsmith will also be on that panel, and we'll be having a very special one-off hour-long podcast chat together, which is going to be recorded in front of a live audience. And again, there are only a handful of tickets left for that night, as in, I think, less than 20 tickets at this point. So please, if you can, get to that Halloween show in London on Halloween night. Grab your ticket ASAP. For any of these events, simply head on over to evolutionofhorror.com/events. That's evolutionofhorror.com/events.
Someone here can see.
Get him out. Might be more than one.
There's a door. Get him out.
Get him out. Get him out.
We want him.
Out, you bastard. Out.
Guys, I want to talk a little bit about this whole epidemic of blindness, I suppose, that the story focuses on. So obviously this meteor shower that everyone stares at, it renders them all blind. How do you find the way in which the show kind of treats that, the portrayal of these people who can no longer see? Because I think there are some interesting things that the story does, where initially they're almost treated as like a threat, right? Like it's almost like they're zombies in a zombie apocalypse film. Like they're kind of scratching at the doors. They seem to move around in packs. They're quite threatening, but also, of course, they're portrayed as quite helpless too. And the show, the story, and these characters are kind of torn, I think, between, do we spend time helping these people and trying to rebuild a society with them, or do we just get away from them and try and sort of start something, despite them almost, I suppose. And it's kind of tricky ground the way it's portrayed at times, I find. But yeah, how did you find it, James, the way in which this particular show and this adaptation kind of treats the afflicted people, I suppose?
Well, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because it's basically building upon that quote, that famous quote, "In the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king."
Mm-hmm.
So you've got all these few characters that can see have this power over everyone else who can't see. But in doing that, these people which can't see seem that much more dangerous to a degree, because they will do anything to survive, but they don't quite have the capabilities to sort of control these people that can see. So it's this kind of weird juxtaposition of the two. Like, you've got these dangerous people which will do anything to survive, but they can't see, so they can't get at you, but that is a terrifying concept to someone who can see. So there's like a moment in the TV show when Bill and Joe are driving along, and then they're suddenly accosted by all of these blind people who can hear the truck that they're driving, and they start attacking them. And it's this kind of, it is like, they're like zombies, aren't they?
It's quite a good balance, actually, that strikes, isn't it? Matt, when it first started, I was a little bit worried that the blind people were just going to be portrayed as like zombie monsters, essentially, right? And actually, I really love that it's actually much more nuanced than that, isn't it, as it goes on?
Yes, it is, like over the course of 6 episodes, but there are definitely scenes where they are absolutely treated like that. They are literally presented as, you know, exactly the way you would depict a zombie horde. And
they kind of shuffle along slowly
and attack people and want to grab you and seemingly eat you, but that's not, you know. And at times that made me really uncomfortable. And it's not just like the depiction of blind people, but also like the depiction of the concept of blindness. And I would be interested to know what a blind person thought of this story, because you know, it's an apocalyptic event, and the apocalyptic event is that everybody goes blind. And I'm not, you know, if everyone went simultaneously blind, that would have unbelievably huge ramifications for society as we know it. But, you know, would it devolve?
People can live a whole life being visually impaired and it not be a apocalyptic scenario.
And granted, like, you know, the first week, if the entire population went blind, would be pretty catastrophic.
Chaos.
But I think that we would not be talking about how do we rebuild society, you know. I guess, you know, you throw in walking plants that are trying to eat people, then
I think that's what it is as well.
that this has. But I would be interested to know what a blind person thought of this story, because you're right, it does get more nuanced than that, but there is a certain depiction of blind people and blindness that made me a little bit uncomfortable at times.
And I think the character of Jack Coker, James, is really interesting in that regard, isn't he? Because he's introduced at the beginning as being this guy that wants to help the people that can't see, and to the point where he's really forceful. Like, he wants to actually kind of like almost enslave the people that can see and kind of, you know, force them to be these guides, right, for the blind people and everything. And then, so you almost think, like, is he a villain? And again, I kind of like the kind of morally grey murkiness of this character as well, you know?
Yeah, I think in the book, he's much more antagonistic.
Oh, right.
Because he is literally, he is making them do what he wants to do. Like, he wants to save the rest of the civilization. He is forcing the people that can see to help the blind. And I think in this you get that one scene where they're all at the gates of the university, and that's about it in terms of him sort of forcing people into it. But then you see a different character who's getting Bill to, like, you get a different character who's getting Bill to look after a certain, like, a colony of blind people.
Yeah.
So, I don't know, but then I think with the TV show as well, the shift from antagonist to ally is just a bit too quick. But again, it's
everything
the
happens
time
so
they've got
quick,
to do
doesn't
it.
it?
Yeah, they don't have time to linger on anything. But I think Coker is a really interesting character because he does start off as, well, he's supposed to start off as this guy who you think is, he is the bad guy. But as time goes on, you identify with what he's trying to do, and you can see it from his point of view. And that's very important with this, because all of the different factions, the different groups that you see in this TV show are supposed to, that you can believe where they're coming from. You can see exactly what they want. They're coming from like a place of fear, a place of not knowing what to do next, and they see this as the best option, whether that's a polyamorous community, whether that's a full military Britain going back to the feudal states, or whether that's looking after the people less off than you, who need a helping hand in order to keep surviving. So it's just seeing which one of those ideologies survive. And Coker is a key character in depicting that in the show.
Yeah, you see this kind of ideology around the world even now, Matt, right? Like you'll get factions of people that want to help the people that need it more, but maybe they have to find more kind of like mandatory ways in order to do that. And then you've got other people that are kind of more out for themselves and just want to kind of like get by. And like I think this kind of deals with that really cleverly. I like that whole section where Coker does basically kidnaps Bill and Joe, separates them, chains them up, and makes them become these guides for these blind people that he's got under his care. And he is almost kind of treated as a villain there with what he's doing, but then actually Bill starts to find that he starts to kind of find that humanity, and he wants to help people actually once that's happened, right? And I kind of thought that was an interesting little arc in the middle of this.
Yeah, there's like a timeless sort of concept of humanity just being factional and being unable to get along with itself and causing trouble, but at the same time it dips into sort of almost utopian thinking with the way that Coker is. I mean, he's a militant humanitarian,
right?
But then he also very quickly learns his lesson and changes his ways. And you also have other, factional groups who just split off and go their separate ways. Like later on, Coker's whole sell is like, come to the Isle of Wight. If you don't like it, we know some people already left. They didn't like it. We went away peacefully, and they're living happily on the Channel Islands. And it happens in Tinsham as well, doesn't it? They have a disagreement about this enforced polyamory thing, and thankfully it hasn't got bloody and violent. They've just been like, all right, well, we'll pack up and leave and do our thing elsewhere. You guys can keep Tinsham, and good luck to you. There's this surprisingly utopian everyone getting along, which turns dark at the end with the sort of the entrance of this pseudo military group.
Yeah,
but we don't know if they might have also been able to learn a lesson. It seems like everyone else is actually able to learn the right lessons and get along with each other in there.
Yeah, apart from the group of sort of early 80s punks, right?
Oh, yeah,
just come at them with a gun and just start shooting and killing people, basically. But yeah, you're right. Like, it's like that word you used, James, like, there's a kind of coziness about it almost, isn't there? That actually, like, all of these things, I think we're used to, especially you guys are probably used to having seen so many dystopian post-apocalyptic stories. I kept expecting more violence to happen, and a lot of the time it was people just going, all right, we'll just go our separate ways, But
the violence is supposed to be from the Triffids, though, isn't it, as well?
Yes.
It's as much as it's a story about, like, the humans doing bad things to other humans and beating each other up, and then, like, there's a scene where there's a bunch of, like, almost football hooligans.
Yeah.
And they grab this girl and they're like, oh, you want a girl? Here's a nice one. Yeah, she's great. Yeah. So it's like, it's got all of these undertones. But again, it's a BBC TV show that we're watching in this scenario. And it's, they can't linger on that stuff for too long.
Does the book get into that violence a bit more then?
Not graphically, but you know what's happening. You know that kind of stuff. And there's, like, it goes into more detail about when Joe's chained up the first time, when she's like, that blind guy grabs her and then makes her his eyes. There's a lot of that kind of stuff going on.
Let's talk about the plants then, the Triffids themselves. Obviously, this is like I've said, we've talked about it with films like The Happening. It's a hard thing to make scary and threatening, I think. But Matt, how did you find it, the portrayal of these deadly Triffids in this particular adaptation?
I thought it was okay in the context of the show.
Yeah,
they look pretty cheesy, but I didn't really have a problem with that. I think it fitted into the world of the show fairly well, and I felt they film them in a really interesting way, which is that they're just sort of there. They're just like hanging out.
They're just kind of lingering on the periphery.
And that is very deliberate, and I think that works really well where, maybe the sort of the design of them isn't so good. I think what I didn't really like, or it didn't really work for me, was they're very I want to say anthropomorphized, but that means they're human-like, doesn't it? But they're animal-like. They've been made to look like recognizable animal tropes. They've got, I don't know if they have 4 legs, but they sort of look roughly 4-legged, long neck, sort of giraffe-shaped. They have a sort of recognizable animal shape. And I think they would have been more scary if they were more plant-like. You know, they have a face as well. Not really. It's the flower, but it's like a big gaping mouth that looks like it's screaming. So almost like trying to make them look like a scary animal, I feel like is the wrong direction. They should look more plant-like and like they wouldn't bite you and eat you.
Yeah.
And I think that would be more scary that they are biting you and eating you. Does that make sense?
It does make total sense. I think you're right. Like almost that kind of, like we've talked about it with other things, like the girl with all the gifts or whatever. But like when you've got this kind of world that is overgrown with these like mysterious plants, that can be scarier, I think, than you're right. These kind of demonic, and I guess that's part of the original story too, James. Right? Is that they're actually described as having like legs, like they can walk. These plants can actually walk as well, which is kind of, it's such a really fun idea, but it is also a little bit silly, I think.
I mean, walking plants that are making some sort of sound, like beating their bellies to communicate. But then that sound in this, I think the sound in this is really effective because you are, like, it adds to the horror, doesn't it? You're hearing this kind of weird ethereal sound as they're sort of like drumming themselves.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, you know. But then at the same time, it's like, it's interesting you talk about the design, Matt, because the way you were sort of, you wanted them to be more animalistic almost, it sounds
less
like.
animalistic.
Less animalistic.
Less animalistic. I want it to be more like a plant.
Yeah, because then that's the thing, because that's the weird sort of, when you're depicting plants on screen as being like, sort of like Venus flytraps, being carnivorous, if you look at like Audrey 2.
Yeah.
Like that's a prime example of a carnivorous plant, and they've given him teeth. Like Little Shop of Horrors, it's very much depicted as this big man-eating plant. So in this, it's less teeth, but they've got the big swatter, which is kind of, I think that feels more plant-like to me. And it feels more like a dangerous
the
plant.
The thing that comes out and stings them is good. That felt like something that was quite a sort of natural nature thing that a plant could do to you almost, which I quite appreciated. It's more when they're...
Like, what is it? The stigma, the stamen?
Oh, God.
I forget about my biology classes. It's one of those.
So bad. All that stuff.
The root.
All of those bits.
And I guess in some ways they are like... It's, you know, when you get animals, Matt, even if you're an animal lover, you can see how in movies they're fun to make into monsters because they've got teeth, because they want to eat, because plants we associate with something a little bit more benign, right? Like they're not actively threatening most of the time. 90% of plants and flowers, they look beautiful, they give us oxygen, they give us life, right? They're not perceived generally as a threat. So it's actually quite difficult to twist them and make them dangerous in fiction.
Yeah. They're ornamental things that you just think of your own garden, don't you? Like it's hard to sell them as a beast unless it's kind of in a more jungle context where you could be in genuine danger from the plant life.
But when you're in a post-apocalyptic Britain and they keep growing back and there's no way to stop the seeds, I think that makes it more terrifying. But it's a gradual terror. It's not like the fast-paced terror of an animal coming to attack you. And also these Triffids are, like you said before, they're in the peripherals, they're in the background. They're meant to be this kind of thing you forget about for a while, and then you might just be going to go and do something down the road and you get hit by one of the stingers and you're dead. And then it's going to digest you over time because no one's coming to save you because everyone's blind and the world's gone to shit.
And also no one really takes the Triffids seriously, do they? Bill is kind of like the only one banging the drum because he's got this particular post-apocalyptic competency of I worked on a Triffid farm, and he seems to be the only person left around who takes them seriously and knows about them and knows that they are a genuine threat, smarter than we think. They're going to break down fences if you don't keep an eye on them, stuff like that. So he's the only one who's actually really taking them seriously. So everyone is at this added level of risk from Triffid attack because they're just like, oh, just Triffids. We just farm them for their oil. They're not going to do anything.
It's just like us. We're not taking them seriously now, even after having watched all the repercussions. We're like, it's fine. We'll just get a Triffid gun and some flamethrowers, be all good.
Yeah, you're so right about that. I think that's true, because I think, again, like going into it, I thought this was going to be much more of a kind of constant threat, and it was going to be people versus Triffids. And you're right, like actually for the most part, people don't even seem that bothered about the Triffids. They're so much wrapped in their own human issues and societal issues, and then the Triffid attacks are really few and far between, and probably because of that they're quite effective, like because you do almost forget and then suddenly they're just there, they pop up. Is it in the last episode, Matt, where there's that almost like home invasion siege by Triffids where they're all outside the windows of the house? Again, like that was a pretty effective kind of horror set piece, I thought, where it finally built to that point now where they were trapped, basically. Yeah,
that was really cool. Like when they're on the windows, like you say. However, doesn't that scene then immediately cut to them standing over a pile of burned Triffids? So you do get that great imagery of them like almost knocking in the windows and they've kind of come out of nowhere. But then it's just like, whoop, thank God that's over with, and we've burnt all these Triffids out.
I know, it's so interesting. Again, like just how quickly the story moves. Like, you almost could have made a whole 6-part series about any one of these multiple little moments that they move on with so quickly, you know? Yeah.
I think they don't spend enough time dwelling on it in this, which is quite tricky, because I think back to when I read the book and when they meet Susan, when Bill meets Susan for the first time, the young girl who they sort of take on, and you find out her brother's dead, and it's that realization, because she's too young to realize that her brother's been killed by a Triffid sting.
Yeah.
And that really hits home there. And I think there's so many more moments of horror when you're reading it as opposed to this, because again, they can't dwell on it too much because they've got to move on to the next bit that's happening. But I think it's got all of those elements in there. And for me, it's kind of, but it works like The Last of Us, like you've referenced a few times. That show is all about the human element, and then it's just got this added extra of this weird fungus making people zombies. And I think that's exactly what the Day of the Triffids is doing. It's the human element, and it's that post-apocalyptic, like, what are we going to do when we're back to square one and we don't have the technological advancements that we do now? How do we keep society running? And that's probably where the real horror is.
Yes.
Like, what do you do at this point? And like, how do you survive as a species? And then, okay, so this other species, this plant species, the Triffids, which you think are some ridiculous creatures which are just there for the oils, no one really cares about them, and then suddenly they become like the owners of the planet, basically, because you can't stop them.
Yeah. And I wonder kind of like what the ultimate fate is of all of these characters, right? Because it ends, Matt, kind of slightly ambiguously, right? There's that, again, the weird little kind of like mini arc at the very end where those kind of military guys come in, and our main group of characters have to basically just get them all pissed and then like sneak out the next morning. And then it just kind of ends, right, as this group of characters kind of head off. Like, do you think it's ultimately optimistic the way this show ends, or do you think they're doomed? What do you reckon?
I don't. I think that the specific way it ends, with them driving off and him narrating that essentially everything's going to be okay.
Yeah.
Didn't fill me with that much hope, because we kind of, it's just like this addendum, like of what he hopes might happen. It just doesn't fill me with much hope, and the most organised group we've seen has just been quite scary and unpleasant and threatening to them. So that was not great. I was reading like a little summary of the book, and I just read sort of a description of how it ends, and it does sound like the book might end on a more directly hopeful note and actually show them arrive in the Isle of Wight.
Right.
James, I don't know if you think it's got a bit more of a positive spin at the end of the book.
Yeah, it doesn't have that kind of definite ending. It's kind of, right, if we try really hard, we can get back to where we were. I feel like the TV show is almost more optimistic than the book. Yeah, just in slight tone. There's only a very slight tonal difference for me anyway. And I think it is open to interpretation. But I felt that when I was watching this. I felt like they're driving off into the sunset. They're going to go to the Isle of Wight. Everything's good. But in the book, it's kind of like, yeah, we can do it, but it's going to be a real hard graft to get there.
And do you think ultimately this story is about nature biting back, or is it about mad science, right? Going back to the idea of, my podcast and what I'm doing and your podcast and what you're doing, and Day of the Triffids kind of working as this kind of text that belongs in between those two subgenres, because James has already mentioned there is this kind of suggestion that what happens here with the Triffids and what happened with the meteor shower may be connected, and it may be down to human beings, right? There is a kind of monologue that Bill gives that kind of goes into some of this.
They never told us. They never asked us. I suppose one of these weapons had been specially constructed to emit a radiation that our eyes couldn't stand. Something that would burn out the optic nerve.
Something like that couldn't blind the whole world.
Suppose there was an accident. This weapon would be meant to operate at very low levels so that it only blinded the people they wanted to blind. But after the accident, it went off so far up that anyone on Earth could receive direct radiation from it. What about the mysterious disease? Where did that come from? We were walking on a tightrope for a hell of a long time. Sooner or later, the foot had to slip.
Matt, there's a suggestion, right, that perhaps the blindness was caused by a weapon gone wrong with satellites. Obviously, the Triffids were farmed by us and potentially even genetically engineered by us for their oil, right? So ultimately, is this not a nature bites back story, but actually more of a mad science, humans' own hubris kind of a story?
Yeah, I think so. But they're very they're very gentle with how they do that. It's just implied. We just have Bill to go with, and even Bill's not that sure about it. He's just sort of talking, feeling a bit cynical, I think, at that point, and just being like, well, it's probably all just man-made. Probably satellites up in space and a weapon that caused everyone to go blind. It's not really definitive. There's no intention to make it definitive. It's very clear that, like, we're not going to know, they're not going to know. There's no way of knowing. And the more important thing is the moving on from that. But yeah, I do think that, like, throwing that line in is basically saying that's what it is. This is what it's about. They're not directly linked, but these are all man-made faults that have caused this carnage.
Yeah. Do you get that, James, from it as well? And is that part of the novel too, that there's ultimately that kind of like men messing with nature kind of message almost?
Yeah, because obviously in the TV show, again, they go into it with the idea of like the Triffids being manufactured in Russia.
Yes, it's always Russia as well, isn't it?
It's always Russia, but then obviously it's still the Cold War. Like, the book was written in 1951, wasn't it? And then this is made in the 80s. The Cold War lasted for a long, long time, till like 91. And also there's all of this stuff when Wyndham was writing it as well. There was stuff like there was a geneticist called Trofim Lysenko who was making all these weird genetic theories about how what was it? He was a Soviet scientist who promoted false ideas about genetics, which caused a lot of harm to farming and science in the Soviet Union. So he believed plants could inherit traits because of their environment, which is scientifically wrong. It was against like this whole other scientific theory that Gregor Mendel put in place. And that sort of like goes into like genetics, about genetics and stuff, and you get traits from genetics. But Lysenko was perpetuating this idea that you could grow something in a harsh place and then it would be tough, and then that would translate into the other things that grew. So when Wyndham's writing this, all of this stuff is in the air as well. So you've got the pseudoscience happening, you've got the Cold War. So this book kind of feels like it's joining both of those things. And for me, the meteor shower sounds more realistic if it's a satellite going up, causing the blindness. And then that sort of, it makes all of the dots connect a bit more as this kind of man-made post-apocalyptic world. And we created the Triffids. We created this catastrophe. It's human hubris. we're at fault. It's mad science. It's nature biting back, nature that we've created and we sort of tried to mess with. We've tried to mess with nature to try and get these special oils from the Triffids, and it's all come and bitten us on the arse.
Yeah,
so that's what I get from it.
It's a good mix
I agree,
of all of that, isn't it? I agree as well. And what did you make of the sort of mysterious virus or disease that people were getting as well, Matt? Like, again, we don't really know what's the cause of that, do we?
No, but it works, doesn't it? Because the way the Triffids are, almost this red herring in terms of how the plot works, and it's really more about a disaster that causes civilization to fall apart. It just feels natural that there just be like some other problem as well, isn't it? It just kind of like fits in. So weirdly, you've got these main plot concepts that seem like they don't gel together, but the fact that they don't gel together allows you to just like bolt in other things and just say like, this is happening as well. And it's like, yeah, this all kind of fits into the tapestry of the show. And like James is saying, all of that holds together a bit more cohesively if you believe what Bill suspects, that it's all just like failures of man-made things that have gone badly wrong.
Yeah. It reminded me a little bit of... Have you guys seen Threads, the BBC TV special from the mid-80s?
I've not dared, Mike.
Yeah,
I've heard so much about that.
It's one of the most upsetting things I've ever seen in my life, but it has almost similar themes. I mean, there was clearly something in the zeitgeist in Britain in the 80s that people were really worried about, kind of the end of the world, I think, right? But like the Threads is much more overt, where it kind of really shows you what happens after an atomic bomb goes off in Sheffield, and it goes through time, and it's not just the bomb and the aftermath of that, but it's then diseases and crime and society crumbling, and everything you could imagine possible like happens because of, again, something so evil that man has created, essentially, and it has impacts on nature and everything else. It's very similar.
It's realistic fears, though, isn't it? And that's kind of where like sci-fi and horror are at their best, when they're looking at the possible futures and the catastrophes that could happen, and then making a comment on that before it happens. So hopefully we're shaking some politicians by the shoulders and being like, don't fuck it up.
Exactly.
Don't start a Cold War. Don't do this.
Yeah.
And then hopefully we won't be surrounded by Triffids in our farms.
We all just need to live in a polyamorous community on the Isle of Wight, I think. That was the message I got.
Or go to the South Downs.
Yeah. It's so middle-class English, isn't it? I love it.
Did you not want to be a feudal lord, Mike, with all of your blind compatriots?
Yeah. I thought you were going to say patrons then. I was like, not all of my patrons are blind,
your
James.
blind patrons.
So there you go. There have been loads of other adaptations of this, and I haven't really seen them, but there was a recent TV adaptation. I don't think it was as successful. Like, people didn't seem to like it as much as this early 80s one. But do you think, could you ever see this getting a bit of a new modern remake as like a movie or anything? Matt, what do you reckon? Is this story like ripe for a retelling, do you think?
I think there's something so of the time Cold War-y about it that I think makes it not hard to adapt. I think it's probably very easy to adapt and remake whenever, but that it I think it feels like it was probably perfected in a Cold War context. This was made ages after the book came out, but the Cold War was still, a serious prospect. So I think it still would have felt very relevant for those themes. So I think you can remake it, but I really think this is an excellent series for all its sort of faults and stuff. And from what you've said and what James said about the book, it sounds like very faithful to the book. So I don't really see the need for a remake, especially if there's like tons of versions that already exist. Like, no need to go back to the well.
What do you reckon, James? And also, I suppose the thing is, we've also got stuff like 28 Days Later and The Last of Us and all these other things as well, right? That also kind of almost feel like they owe a debt to Day of the Triffids anyway.
Yeah, I feel like maybe not this book in its entirety, or this adaptation in its entirety. I think there are interesting things you can do with this kind of idea, and it can be updated for today's sort of modern audience. But the tricky thing is making sure that the Triffids are as terrifying as they can be.
Yeah.
But that's very difficult when you've got walking plants that look like Venus flytraps.
Yes.
Yeah, you need a different way. So like, you can do this, but I think there are other ways to do this kind of story now, given all of the wealth of post-apocalyptic films that have been made, all of these different sort of nature bites back films, all of these sort of like nature gets its own back on humanity. I think there are other more interesting ways to do it, but I think, like you said, a lot of those film stories now owe a lot to this initial adaptation and book from John Wyndham.
Yeah, it's kind of really interesting to look at, actually, just as almost like a bit of a ground zero for a lot of these types of stories, almost these kind of post-apocalyptic whatever. Yeah, so there you go. Love it. Well, guys, thank you. This has been, as always, such a joy. Remind people, where can they come and find Journey Through Sci-Fi, and like what kind of stuff have you got coming up?
Well, you can find us all over the internet. We are all over the social media channels. You can go to our website, journeythroughscifi.com, and you can find us there, as well as your podcast app of choice. We are currently doing our Mad Science series, so we're exploring the world of mad science, the subgenre in science fiction on screen, and we're covering lots of various mad scientists in all shapes and forms, aren't we, Matt?
Yeah, and we're also on Patreon, patreon.com/Journey Through Sci-Fi, where we do things like The Bad Movie Bunker, Patrons Picks, we cover new movies, and we do mini-series. We're currently working our way through The Expanse, so if that sounds interesting, come and join us on Patreon as well.
Amazing. Guys, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike.
Cheers, Mike. Don't get in by a Triffid.
And that's it for this week. Thank you so much for listening. And one more time, a huge thank you to my brilliant guests, James and Matt from Journey Through Sci-Fi. So I would love to hear from you guys. What do you think of Day of the Triffids? Is this the best adaptation? Have you seen any better ones? I would love to hear your thoughts. Please do get in touch. You can email me, evolutionofhorror@gmail.com. You can also find us on all the socials, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Letterboxd. If you want to discuss this week's episode with fellow listeners, you can join the Evolution of Horror discussion group on Facebook, or you can join the Evolution of Horror Discord. You can find this podcast in all the usual podcast places, and if you get a spare minute, I'd be so grateful if you could drop us a little rating and review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or whatever is your podcast app of choice, as it always helps us get discovered by new listeners. So, on to next week then, and oh my god, we've got a pretty powerful double bill of films to cover next week, because next week we're moving sort of slightly out of the world of fiction, particularly out of science fiction, and we're going to be talking about something a little bit more real, something a little bit closer to home. Next week I'm going to be joined by Rihanna Dillon, and we're going to be talking about Raw from 1981, known as one of the most dangerous films ever made, and we're going to be following that up with Werner Herzog's Grizzly Man from 2008. These are two, in some ways, deeply upsetting films about what happens when human beings really do fuck with nature. Join us next week for all of this and more on the Evolution of Horror.